the capability of the advanced frontier tools, they are not chatbots anymore. They're intelligence platforms, but getting a smart human to use an intelligence platform well, that's hard. You upskill your people and you put the effort in to change how you work.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Our guest today is Scott McLiver, Partner and Chief AI Officer at PwC New Zealand. Scott is helping organisations across the country and around the world understand, adopt and govern AI technologies. He has led major AI initiatives within PwC, advised boards and executive teams on AI strategy, and is at the forefront of exploring how AI is reshaping business, work and society. Scott, welcome along to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here.
Real pleasure to have you joining us. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, before we start, a big thank you, of course, to our show partners. So a big thank you to Spark, One New Zealand, 2 Degrees, Workday, Fortinet, Gorilla Technology and PwC, of course. So always great to have such fantastic companies behind the show and making the New Zealand Tech Podcast possible. So thanks for your part in that. Well, let's jump in. Very keen to hear more around your perspectives, what you're seeing out there across New Zealand and internationally, because I know your role is not just New Zealand focused. So really keen to hear that. But let's start with delving into some of the local and international tech news. First up next week is Revved 2026. So this was an event that launched last year, and it's positioned very much as an event for New Zealand business and leaders, as a summit sort of bringing together a mix of founders, leaders, investors and chief executives to discuss technology, decision-making, leadership and really the economic opportunities that the likes of AI are facilitating. So looks like an exciting event. If anyone hasn't registered but wants to, then I think this pretty much your last choice. It takes place on 6th of August, Thursday, the Auckland Viaduct Event Centre. I'll be down there, so definitely come and say hi if you're about. So now on to, I guess, a topic, and this is relates to Spark. We've had news through that they're reorganising into 2 operating divisions, connectivity and digital services, and that they've begun a strategic review of their digital services business, which includes cloud and IT operations, to assess what they're saying, assess options for maximising shareholder value. Now, no decision has been made at this time, but this is them, really signalling the potential of the sale of that side of the business. And they're saying at this stage things will continue as normal, but that they expect to have their review complete the first half of fiscal year 2027. And of course their connectivity business is what focuses on mobile, broadband, security, managed services and IoT. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. I think we're in a world where nothing stays the same for too long, does it, Scott?
No, that's right. I think that's just an example of we've heard this word change for a few decades now, but the pace of change is clearly increasing. I think we're going to see more of what you've mentioned there around Spark. They're standing back and making some strategic choices, and hats off to them for looking at their business. I think all leadership teams should be doing their own version of that.
Oh yeah, and it's something that needs to be somewhat continuous, right? In the current world, the current times, you can't just sort of sit back and expect things to keep going.
That's right. Well, they say, isn't it, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
And that never has been more true than now. So it's interesting seeing where that ends up.
Now, also in the news, something I was asked to comment on was ZB over the weekend was this earthquake that took place. I was woken up early hours of the morning And yeah, there was a bit of a rattle, and I thought, oh, haven't experienced that in the house for a while. Now, we're quite close to a reserve where they were doing, millions of dollars worth of earthworks and all sorts. And so there was a while there after we moved into the home where it would shake a bit. But I was trying to think what else could cause this other than an earthquake. Indeed, it was an earthquake, but it brought to mind Google's Android earthquake alert system, which these days covers New Zealand. And I had a little bit of a look into it. It's quite a fascinating, capability. In fact, you've got, many cell phones. I guess, in New Zealand, that's probably in the millions of devices with Android that if their accelerometer, picks something up that could fall into that earthquake type category, then it's pinging that back to the cloud, making a decision, is this being seen on a more widespread basis? And if it is, then, sends out an alert. Now, I didn't get any alerts. I don't think we had any alerts in our home in Auckland, so I'm not quite sure what the radius is for those alerts to come through. But it seems to me that it could be a useful tool to have in the toolkit. Although there's always going to be that feeling of are our phones spying on us in some way. If they alert back on this, can they alert on something else? Although that said, it's very easy to turn it on or off on an Android phone, so I don't think that should really be a concern for anyone.
Yeah, it's like one of the key elements of the news item was that the alert was right, so that they managed to
for some people, because it's got to pick up off an actual movement.
That's right.
I don't think they've worked out a way to know before there's any shaking, right?
Correct, but they before a lot of humans felt the shake, right? So, I mean, I think it's just an example where the use of widespread technology, there's use cases that we haven't considered. That's something that you're like, wow, we've got, like you said, millions of devices, whether it's Android with the earthquake monitoring example or even some incredible examples of wearables picking up material heart problems.
Yes, yeah.
Like I heard one the other day that, a specialist was kind of blown away that this very subtle, heart murmur was picked up by a wearable. I think, they're both just examples of the way that wearable tech is advancing, right?
It really is. And yeah, it was interesting, with the Android alerting because earthquake moves at, thousands of kilometres, an hour. And so you're not necessarily going to get a big warning, but even a small warning can in some cases save a life.
Yeah.
And I came across a story from South America where apparently someone or a group of people were about to get into a lift and they got this alert around the earthquake and decided, let's not get into the lift. And, apparently there was some sort of, collapse in the lift shaft. So, you can certainly have some wins, and it doesn't have to be a high percentage of cases for it to have made a difference.
Absolutely.
Onto the international side of things, I saw a bit of news coming through around hackers hijacking hotel Wi-Fi DNS to steal folks' Microsoft 365 credentials. Now, these sorts of things have been going on for some time. However, we often just don't hear about them because there are so many behind-the-scenes cybersecurity, types of issues. But yeah, I think it's just a good reminder that Wi-Fi that you don't control is not necessarily very safe. And in fact, in New Zealand, we probably have a very large number of Wi-Fi systems, probably built into our routers that have quite likely been compromised because we know a lot of these devices don't get patched and kept up to date, and varying cyber security groups have control of large numbers of routers. So therefore, this could even be happening in your own home where you think you're logging into your work environment and what have you.
Yeah.
And depending on what protections and how well your work environment is set up, you could be falling for the same tricks and handing over credentials and multi-factor authentication tokens to cyber criminals.
Look, absolutely. I think that, as you said, this has been happening for years and, frankly, decades. One of the big changes, though, the last year or two is the tools that these bad actors and cyber threat groups have got at their disposal with AI. So that's the slightly scary bit, and we're in that arms race we talk about, the good players, the defenders of your cybersecurity, trying to stay ahead of the attackers.
Yeah.
And, that's where I think you've got the double-edged sword, or on one side, there's these material threats to large infrastructure we hear about with, whether it's Mythos or whether it's, GPT with Hugging Face recently. But, the local router attacks and Wi-Fi DNSs that you're talking about, Paul, I think that, that might be where a lot of the practical impact's felt, because there just won't be the effort to upgrade those patches and so on.
Yeah. And, hopefully this sort of current wave of issues that we're seeing, and, we've seen huge numbers of vulnerabilities being patched by Microsoft and others, unprecedented level because of the new AI tools they're leveraging. But of course, we've got issues happening from the other direction. And, as you say, last week it was news of open AI going a little bit or a lot rogue and, hacking into Hugging Face. These sorts of things are pretty unprecedented, right? Like this is not a world that we've been used to, and we've only just seen or heard around a few instances. But where there's smoke, there's fire, and I'm sure there must be a lot more going on that we don't know about. And to me, it brings a reminder that as a country, we can no longer be sort of, she'll be right when it comes to cybersecurity, and we've got to step it up and look after all of those basics, which a lot of organisations and individuals have kind of taken for granted, that nobody's going to try and, hack me, but these things happen on a widespread automated basis.
Look, absolutely. The cost for a bad actor to attack now using these tools has dropped to almost zero. And the effectiveness of some of these advanced cyber tools, because that's the bit that a lot of people, maybe at first thought don't quite appreciate, is in making these tools, these AI models, incredibly effective at coding and at patching, it makes them very good at attacking too.
Yeah,
like it's like that, that terrible reality that by making an AI model incredibly good at medicine and biology, you also make them capable of biological weapons. Like it's the two sides to that, and that's where, I do think that there's, the impact of increasingly advanced AI, which we'll talk about more shortly. Cyber is one of the big areas that it feels like that's the first 2 or 3 years of ChatGPT and then these models. We went on this path of, I guess, discovery and productivity and everyone experimenting. Cyber feels like the first threat that's become very real to us in the last sort of 6 months.
Yeah. Now, putting you on the spot here, because I know PwC works pretty closely with OpenAI, but curious, when you heard about that OpenAI had this scenario whereby their model got quite carried away and maybe performed better than intended or expected. What were your thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, geez, I mean, look, it's kind of a few thoughts. One was that this is the start of a new phase that everyone was talking about for months and maybe years, and that's this autonomous model capability to do very complex things without being instructed. Because a lot of the previous examples where they'd mentioned that models had done things, they were kind of coaxed into doing that.
Yes.
This was an example where a model was basically, they had the guardrails removed, which I think is really important for people to understand that in this example with Hugging Face and OpenAI, they deliberately took the protections off the model as they were testing it. So they took the protections off and then said, we want you to do as well as you can on these benchmark tests. And the model chose to maximize its ability to do very well on these benchmark tests, to escape the sandbox and basically find the test answers.
Yeah.
So that's what it did. So in an effort for it to try and do very well on the test, it figured out, well, why don't I escape here and try and find someone that's got the answers?
Yeah.
So to me, my thoughts were, well, firstly, it's great that, and this might sound like a small thing, but that the companies involved, i.e. OpenAI and Hugging Face, are talking about it.
Yeah.
The fact this is all public is long may that continue, right?
Yes,
Because it's very transparent, which is
100%.
critical. But it's an example of this new threat era where these models are no longer just more powerful in a way that's always helpful. Now some of the power is getting big enough that we do need to be very, very deliberate how we govern them. So yeah, like to me, it's that first example of kind of, oh wow, the model got out, right?
Yeah, and like what I've been noticing with the newest models is that they're just they're impressively capable, and it's artificial thought, but the artificial thought seems to think of lots of different scenarios that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of, or if you'd given what you're giving to the AI, to an individual or a small group, you wouldn't necessarily get the level of initiative that it has. And of course, it all happens very fast, and it'll take advantage of whatever tools, data sources that you make available, right? And I guess that's what we've seen here, is it's really taking advantage of everything within its power. And of course, I think there's that level where when we saw OpenClaw come out, and you kind of put two and two together and realized, oh, okay, so yeah, AI with access to the right capabilities, can do very similar things, but at an incredible pace to what people in front of a computer can do.
With the Hugging Face example, and with a lot of the cyber capabilities of whether it's Mythos or this, because it was a mixture of 5.6 Sol and an unreleased model that was the Hugging Face breach.
Yeah.
One of the things those models do is they string together very minor vulnerabilities and turn them into an overall breach.
Yeah.
And that's one of these pieces where, to your point, humans historically, they might find the minor vulnerability and then ignore it, looking for the major breach. These models have shown extraordinary capability of finding 10 minor vulnerabilities that, if stitched together, they can turn it into a breach. And that's an example we haven't really seen as much before. So yes, I think it was a moment, Paul, where I kind of sat back and thought, wow, okay, so this is the start of this next phase.
Yeah.
And that's going to lead to, ultimately more involvement from governments and regulation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the White House has been involved in other releases, but I think you're just going to see more of that.
Yeah. There's a level here where it sort of brings a little bit of a parallel to chess and AI. When we think back and we look at that, I think it goes back to the 1940s and the 1950s. This idea and early sort of capabilities or early research on chess software, and then to the point with, I think, IBM's Big Blue, where we started seeing a capability that was able to defeat the number one human chess player on the planet, and that was nearly 30 years ago, right? So that happened in a very sort of constrained context, but we saw humanity being able to be outdone by a computer that can string together all the possibilities, and now we're just seeing it happen on a much broader range of domains, aren't we?
That's right. Orders of magnitude further, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's a crazy time, that's for sure. Now, also on the list, flock cameras. Now, I'm not sure if you've sort of been picking the news on these, but there was a big thing. I think it was the Super Bowl last year, and I think it was Ring in a partnership with Flock were touting that their cameras were going to be able to be helpful in finding lost pets, and people hit the roof with just, hold on, you're taking the private footage off my camera and you're going to string it all together around the country, and yes, there's a good outcome, but actually this doesn't look good. This is mass surveillance. And I was reading, it was the Verge who came through and a few others talking about how these flock cameras, they've been hugely adopted across the US, by law enforcement, primarily and initially with a focus on reading number plates. But this has happened on now such a large scale. And when a law enforcement, group, so, a police force in, some random part of the US, turns this sort of technology on or invests in it, they're actually joining into much, much bigger sort of mass surveillance program, because Flock takes the data that they give and adds it to all the other data, and then sits on that data for, I think that the typical is a 30-day data retention, even though I think in some states or regions there are limitations on what they're allowed to do. I think, when you're taking surveillance footage, you can keep it as low as 3 minutes, I think, in one particular area. This to me is fascinating, because we've got so used to having things like a Ring doorbell camera, cameras in the street to detect that you're driving in the bus lane and what have you. And, to a degree that it feels a little bit weird and a little bit uncomfortable. But once you start sort of joining all that data together, that seems to be really getting people's back up. And what I was reading was saying we're now seeing in the US, from right across the political landscape, it doesn't seem to matter what leaning folks are, there's a huge pushback against this particular company and this level of surveillance.
Yeah, I think it's just another example, Paul, of that's a societal issue that I think there's going to be a lot of debate about over the next probably 5-10 years. There's been a bit of talk around AI, because that's really what's enabling the flock cameras, right?
Yeah.
Because without the capability of current and advancing AI, the human hours to do that is just not really possible. So AI is enabling. The cost of kind of mass surveillance has plummeted. And that's where, one of the threats, I saw an interesting piece, I can't actually remember what publication it was from, but basically just talking about one of the challenges society is going to have over the next decade is figuring out that piece of what's acceptable and what's not. Yeah. Because we used to have a barrier of kind of the physical cost of that type of surveillance was significant. Now it's a server and some AI. So I think that, like all those things, it's great that we can reunite pets with their owners. It's great that and frankly, even more importantly, hopefully reduce crime, right? But there is like most benefits, there's a cost to it, and society's going to have to decide what is the cost we're willing to pay. But I think it's another example of the Industrial Revolution allowed society to change in a whole number of ways. The AI revolution is going to provide a whole bunch of other choices that we're going to have to make as a society.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating time, but we do have to delve in and have these discussions, right? So
totally.
We come out the other end, and we've made really good, wise decisions. And one thing that seems to have happened, and the flock cameras probably falls into that sort of situation, is these things kind of just happen slowly over time. So, while we're not paying attention, suddenly the world changes, right? And so I think, we actually have to start maybe being a bit more proactive around thinking around, do we want these things? And if we want them, what's the right context to have them in? And so, yeah.
And even simple things like you mentioned that, is there look, the flock cameras have a opportunity to do XYZ, but it's a 10-minute data retention, or, even those things there become quite different, that, holding all the activities on Paul's front lawn for 2 years is different from, 10 seconds watching for a number plate, you know?
Yeah. And then, how secure is all that data? And I remember us talking some years ago around whichever company it was that was capturing a lot of that number plate information, I think maybe at the borders, and they got hacked, right? So because they kept that data, they created a honeypot, and
Yeah.
somewhat inevitably, someone broke in and stole it. So there we go. Now we don't talk about gadgets on the New Zealand Tech Podcast as much as we once did. In many ways, because the innovation curve had smoothed off a little bit for a while there. It was very steep, and we were seeing so many amazing new devices. But one that caught my attention last week was the announcement of Samsung's Galaxy Z Fold 8, and we've had the Z Fold, obviously all the other previous sort of iterations. But what they did with last week's announcement, 3 folding phones, 2 that look somewhat similar to what they've been releasing over the last few years. The Z Fold 8 sort of jumped out at me because it's a bit of a different form factor. It's more a passport type size screen and device, which actually I really liked. And so they sent a preview one over, which has got all sorts of warnings on it about confidentiality and no photos allowed and all sorts of stuff, I guess because it hasn't landed in the market just yet. But I had a little bit of a play around with it, and that format to me seems like a really nice format. And because it gives you also, the full front screen when it's closed, which is, it doesn't feel a whole lot thicker than some other smartphones just to use that front screen. It's a reasonable size. And then when you want the bigger screen, you can flip it open, you can turn it around and so on. So just thought that was worth the mention. Bit of a change from Samsung now to have 3 quite different form factor foldables in the market, and they seem to be very much dominating when it comes to smartphones on the Android side. Although I have recently been trying out Motorola's signature handset, which I think it is quite interesting to see that coming through competition wise as well. But we might pick that one up another week.
On the gadgets, I mean, it seems like a really interesting form factor. I agree that it does feel nice to have the full front screen and the open. But I think when you think about the impact of the interface changing, I see we're almost in this battle between phones getting bigger via the fold. That's certainly happening, and there's rumours of Apple doing that, but time will tell. But then you've got a lot of leading voices, Mark Zuckerberg for starters, who thinks that the phones have peaked and we're not going to have phones, and it's more glasses like you're wearing, Paul. And I do think then you look at, OpenAI released their little mini keyboard device in the last week or so. Johnny Ives is working on a personal device that apparently is coming out. So you're right, we've kind of had the status quo for probably a decade of what phones have progressed like, or maybe in 15 years. Now we've got this new period of, frankly, uncertainty. I think it's not out of the question that, in 5 to 10 years from now, the dominant device maybe isn't a traditional phone. Like, it might be that AirPods and the glasses are what 30% of people prefer, or so it's all been driven by the fact that you've got a true natural language interface. That means that a true keyboard isn't as necessary.
AI is the big enabler, isn't it? And it makes these other things completely possible in a way that wouldn't we wouldn't have really thought of going a decade or so back.
I mean, in some ways, the perfect glasses are maybe the future, aren't they? Like, if you had full 4K res heads-up display, perfect vision of what you're looking at, and just voice.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how that would be pretty attractive. And there is the whole thing of whether you're so many scenarios, you look around a place and whether it's public transport, on a plane, whatever, and everyone's sort of staring at their smartphone, and I'm not sure that we need to spend as much time interacting with the devices as we do now.
Does that mean, Paul, that we're going to see people just staring forward at their glasses? Everyone just sitting still, looking forward through their glasses,
eyes glazed out. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one with some of these new devices, like a pocketable device that's maybe capturing audio around you and allows you to interact with it by voice, and the glasses. I think there's And of course, similar things are possible with a smartphone, but I think there's a privacy factor, and we're sort of starting to see this. We're starting to see a fair bit of commentary
Well, it's the
around
flop
people that
discussion
are,
over again, isn't it?
that are actually uncomfortable with glasses that have got cameras in them. And I didn't see any local news on it from Samsung, but I saw internationally that Samsung are jumping into a similar space with glasses with cameras on them, and so these partnerships are kind of happening all over the place. And that's one that I haven't kind of reconciled and decided, that's something that should
I agree.
that should happen from my perspective. And I remember chatting to a friend, and he had one of his senior execs came into a meeting, and he was wearing maybe Meta glasses or Snap glasses and so on. And it was interesting that their organisation didn't have any sort of policy that had made this person think that they shouldn't turn up with this completely personal device that could be recording business conversations and so on. And there's a degree to which often that isn't well covered with personal smartphones in a business and so on. So there's a bit of a way to go in figuring some of these things out in terms of what we're really comfortable with as society. So interesting times ahead. Now, there's been a lot going on in the news from an AI perspective. We've touched on some of those things. Just curious, looking at the US, the White House has had I guess an increasing level of involvement with AI in a way we maybe haven't seen with past technologies. What are your thoughts on the role that they're playing?
Yeah, I think so. Look, absolutely. With the White House was involved in rolling back Fable 5, obviously, and then involved in requiring the delay of the release of 5.6 Sol. So the two most recent frontier models from the Frontier Labs, OpenAI and Anthropic, have had White House imposed restrictions on them releasing them. And look, I think that was just inevitable. I think the only debate really is whether they have been restricted too early or too late, right? And the reason I say that is, as was shown by the OpenAI Hugging Face breach, as has been widely reported by those that have had early access to Mythos, these models have become incredibly powerful. So I think that there's not many things in our society that become that powerful and they don't have a form of regulation, right? So I certainly saw this coming for a long time. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be, mid 2026 or end of 2027, but it felt like that was inevitable. And I think that so they've got involved. I think that was just a reality as these tools become so powerful. When you've truly got cyber threats in place, right? But where that kind of leads to a couple of kind of really interesting, I guess branches of that discussion. One is that you can't open a bank account, you can't get a credit card without KYCing who you are.
Right.
If you want to send money,
know your customer
know
steps
your customer,
you have to go
right?
through.
And look, for better or worse, I just think that and I heard this on a podcast recently. If you need to give your address and phone number to get a certain level of prescription from the pharmacy, to buy a certain quantity of fertilizer because that chemical can be used, and so it's not surprising that, hey, if you want to use Mythos 5, we're going to also need to know who you are. So I think that for the most advanced cyber capable models, and once again, I don't think this is going to be tomorrow. I don't think something is necessarily needed tomorrow. But I think that, just like, there's society has decided to open up a bank account to transfer funds globally has a minimum level of, I guess, disclosure, whether it's KYC, anti-money laundering, and so on. I think we're going to see a form of that for the most advanced models. Now, we've kind of got that. The initial version of that we've got is the White House has basically restricted the most advanced models from those two companies to approved users.
Yes, yeah.
So
very small group.
Correct, a very small group. Now, that absolutely, Paul, raises a digital divide. What happens to the other 99.9% of businesses that don't get access to it? So I completely sympathise with those elements. So I don't think it's an easy answer. it's made much more complicated by the speed at which the open source models like Kimi K3 are improving. So the speed at which they're improving, and depending on which benchmark you rate, we've now entered an era in the last week where an open source model is arguably the most capable model on some of the frontier benchmarks.
Yeah,
right?
this is quite interesting. Why do you think that is? Is this entirely down to distillation? Because if you're actually beating models, we've heard about, well, look, these open source models and Chinese models and so on are, basically using distillation, techniques, which the frontier, companies themselves are using to sort of, boil down, capabilities. How do you see that sort of fitting together? Have you got sort of clarity on what might be
certainly
happening?
don't have clarity, but I mean, I think it's an example where despite the massive capital expenditure and the investment and the lead that some of the frontier labs have had, it does show how human ingenuity is still very important, right? Now, we saw that with DeepSeek a while ago, with the DeepSeek moment. We've seen it a little bit again with Kimi K3. The distillation thing, my personal view on that is that that's a terms of service issue, right? Like you've got this kind of ironic situation where the frontier labs are in an IP war and court cases about them effectively distilling human knowledge from elsewhere.
Yeah.
And now they're upset that, people are trying to distill from them. So it's kind of this chain of distillation.
Yeah. Fascinating.
But with Kimi K3, I think these open source models are a reason why we can't be slow to how as a society we're going to respond to these incredibly capable models, because the Mythos ban and the 5.6 sol delay, they have very short-term impacts because only a few months later you've got almost similar models that are downloadable.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of a bit of a leg up from using these models, but also there's clearly some very smart architecture and human ingenuity going into that.
Yeah. Well, keen to sort of delve in a bit more into what's happening in your world at PwC, and really, I guess curious because you have an incredible view on what's happening within PwC, within your clients, both here in New Zealand and internationally. And you're someone that's deeply involved in AI, not just talking about it. So I'm curious. What have you learned most recently? What are the things that really stand out for you?
One of the things that still stands out to me is that most organizations, not just businesses, organizations feel like they're behind. And we're so early in the maturity of this tech and the embedding of it into businesses and organizations. I find that most organizations think that all these other organizations are miles ahead. That's one thing I see quite a lot of. And it's not that I think that there's very few examples of exceptional transformation around AI. Like it's the, you're talking, we all look at NVIDIA and OpenAI and Anthropic, but when you look at actual, not just New Zealand, Australia, Asia, European, US businesses, we're in the first innings of this transformation. So I think that's one thing I constantly see people think that they all think they're behind. Now, look, there is urgency to get moving because we've seen that disruptive technology can have a profound impact in quite a short space of time, right?
Really
But that's one thing I guess I see. But the overall thing, Paul, which, it's almost my soapbox topic now with clients and with us as a firm, is that I think that too many people and businesses are trying to boil the ocean with big and overly ambitious AI projects and build their own stuff.
Yeah.
As opposed to upskilling and change managing their people to use these exceptional frontier tools from these trillion-dollar companies. Like that is the single biggest mistake I see made, and it's also the businesses I see doing very well. They are supercharging their people with this frontier tech. And there's a whole bit ways we can unpack that, but that would be something that I really see.
And, when we talk about agents and agentic AI, we see lots of organizations that, are talking about this is it, this is where we all have to be, and it's right now. But then we see, other organizations are really just trying to upskill, their teams on how to use the basic tools.
Yeah.
And these aren't basic tools, of course, but, how to get the most out of a direct interactive, interaction with whatever AI, platform that they're utilizing.
The organisations that are doing well are supercharging their people, and that might sound like a bit of a cliche, but it absolutely applies to AI, right? So one thing that we've found, if you want to completely remove humans from a process, that's hard. You need very good data, very good guardrails, and extremely accurate knowledge of your processes. It's quite hard. But if you're willing to leave 20 or 30% of the human in and just make them 60 or 70% more efficient, that's not that hard. Because the human 20 to 30% can deal with the jagged edge of the technology, the slightly grey areas, the judgment, the data nuances, right?
And it helps sort of stop the dehumanization that we can land
Look,
on if we go too far, right?
Totally. It does help with that, but even if that's not a goal, it's just the pragmatic way to get the most out of the tech.
Yeah.
So that's where, I would say that is the single biggest mistake I see is organisations that they massively underestimate upskilling and change. It's not a lunch and learn prompting session, right? It's real human change which takes effort.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you supercharge people that know what your customers need, what your business processes to use this tech better.
Yeah.
So that's where I guess, whether it's Claude Enterprise, GPT Business, ChatGPT Business, Gemini or Copilot, those tools backed by trillion-dollar businesses are getting much more capable than most people realise, and simply getting the best out of them is a phenomenal amount of ROI. And that's where, you supercharge your people, that puts you turn all those 5-hour tasks into 1 hour, the 10-hour tasks to 2 hour. Now, they're not glamorous, and that's another mistake I see quite a lot, Paul, is I'd have to say privately owned businesses, mid-market businesses, they are doing better from what I see, because they are saying, hey, look, if you can turn 5-hour tasks to 1 hour, 10-hour tasks to 2 hours, let's go.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes the larger organisations, they're more looking for those headline-grabbing silver bullets, right? The bigger, ambitious initiatives, which let's build our own platform. And it's, I often say it's akin to the internal combustion engine has been created, so everyone wants to build cars. Whereas the smart organisations say, no, we're going to buy trucks and do a logistics company.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So use this incredible tech. And, this is something that you talked about, the interface and gadgets before. The capability of the advanced frontier tools, they are not chatbots anymore. They're intelligence platforms, but getting a smart human to use an intelligence platform well, that's hard.
Yeah.
And I sometimes use the analogy, Paul, with AI, that getting return from AI as a business is like looking good on the beach. It's not sophisticated, but it's hard. You eat healthy and you go to the gym.
Yeah.
We all know it's not sophisticated or complex, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Getting ROI from these frontier tools is not sophisticated either. You upskill your people and you put the effort in to change how you work. It's not complex, but it is hard. But those businesses that put the effort in, I think that 2026 is a year that those leading businesses at a productivity level, they're actually seeing meaningful ROI. But that's a very small group. I would say it's like 5-10%.
Right. Yeah. And in order to really, create that, value and benefit in the organization, how does that tend to happen, practically speaking? Because you can get, tools in the hands of team members who can really join up the dots in terms of how to, transform a particular area of the business. You can also get the, chief executive who's, dabbling with vibe coding and then saying, hey, let's put this into the business, and all sorts of kind of, variations of what are the approaches that, that you're seeing that are really, working well, and what is it that tends to get in the way of stopping, good results?
Yeah, look, that's another great question. Firstly, leadership. Not surprisingly, that's the most key factor. That's the single most determinative factor that I see of organisations that are making progress with AI or not. Yeah. Right. So if you until you have the CEO and leadership team that has a foundational knowledge, their fluency allows them to understand the tech. Yeah. We see quite a lot of business leaders, unfortunately, Paul, that have got quite strong views on AI, but clearly never really used it much. Or if they do, they use it as a Google replacement.
Or they maybe used it enough to see some frustrations with it and haven't maybe kept track of how it's evolved.
That's right. It's very superficial, their understanding and their knowledge, right? So leadership fluency is critical. Until that happens, frankly, like any change, it's just not going to go anywhere. Once you get the leadership buy-in, and you can't have a CEO and two others in the leadership team that are for AI change, but the other 7 are kind of a bit mixed on it. Employees and teams are exceptionally good at knowing of these 10 priorities, these are the 3 that really matter. And those teams know when the AI discussion is just lip service. So not surprisingly, leadership, I think, is by far the most determinative factor, and certainly in the organisations we see and with us. So we treat ourselves as client zero. We have a strong belief that at PwC we can't credibly transform our clients if we can't transform ourselves. Yeah. So we're working very hard to transform ourselves. I'm really proud on some of the progress we're making there. But there's no question when we look back at the lessons we've learned over the last 4 years, leadership involvement is critical. And every time that doubled down, things improved. Yeah, the next bit is the true upskilling though, Paul. So, and like it almost sounds too easy. And once again, it's why I talk about this looking good on the beach is that, once someone starts going to the gym 3 or 4 times a week and sticks with that habit, it almost seems too easy, like just doing this or eating healthy. It's really a case of upskilling your people. Now, what we find that we do, but I don't know whether it's the virtual working or the COVID experience that, society had, but we've almost found, Paul, that virtual upskilling sessions are almost pointless. Now, maybe not pointless, but almost. We find people in the room with the CEO, with their leaders, laptop opened, immersed, not on their phones. We've found that, in as simple as, a couple of 3-hour workshops, you can meaningfully take, people that don't really use AI to be power users. Yeah. But it almost is embarrassing in how simple it is. And here's the other bit that I see organisations. They're obsessed with finding use cases. Certainly what we find is that that's the wrong question to ask. And I think it's a little bit like if you were saying to me, what's the use case for a car? And I'm saying, well, I don't know where you want to go, Paul. Like, I'm not sure where you want to travel. But once I teach you how to drive a car, you're like, oh, so I can go anywhere. Yeah. And we see that time and time again, Paul, with our clients and organisations where we don't have in organisations an Excel team sitting in the middle that people line up to get an Excel sheet created. Yeah. We just teach people how to use Excel.
Yeah, and they'll figure it out.
Correct. Well, they'll apply that tool to their work. Yeah. We see that in spades where the ROI comes from, because you give capable people who are at the front line of business problems, and then with the art of the possible of the tool, then they apply it to their work. Yeah. So when, some of the sessions that it's one of the most rewarding parts of what we do, but, you run some of these workshops, as you upskill teams, the things that they create, you never would have predicted. Because you don't know what they do. No. Even some of the leadership teams were like, oh, really? So Paul, do we do that every month? You're like, yeah, we've got to get this download and check with NetSuite and pull that in from Salesforce. So I don't think that these frontier tools and upskilling your people is the end of AI transformation, but I think it's the massively underestimated first phase. You do need to have some of these bigger, more ambitious transformational objectives, maybe around customer call centers, maybe around software development and its reinvention.
Sure.
But we find that an organization going from, once again, to extend the analogy, lying on the couch eating chips to trying to become an All Black is kind of hard. Whereas if you go step one, why don't we eat healthy and get fit? And then we'll learn how to play rugby.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk to Wayne Smith about tactics, right?
Now, part of this picture, you've talked about, leadership needs to get involved. Is this right up to board level? Do you think that we actually need to be putting boards through 3-hour deep dive sessions to really understand the technology?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, now, they are some of, we probably do, I'm just sharing this as an example of, I guess, demand. We probably do one of them a week now.
Yeah.
So that's how often boards, I find that until boards get there, and I'm pleased you said that kind of 3 hour, because we have found that the 60-minute exec kind of updates, everyone's kind of either sick of them or they're a bit superficial. You need business leaders, and that's what makes this tech so incredible is you sometimes will get the most skeptical and maybe resistant or healthily resistant leader, maybe late in their career, but they've got so much knowledge, expertise, judgment, experience.
Yeah.
Once they cross that threshold of, so this is just a smart brain I can interact with, they become the best users. There's a stat, Paul, that will probably surprise you. Have a guess at PwC New Zealand which cohort of our firm is the largest users of AI. So from interns, grads, senior associates, managers, so on.
Well, the way you're asking that question, I mean, I would have thought this would be those kind of coming in at the intern type level. What's
it's a
the
partners.
reality? Yeah. Wow.
Now we have never ever seen that. We've never had a technology that partners adopted. Now, look, our whole organisation's using it a lot.
Yes.
But by actual quantitative use, the partners per capita are the largest users.
That's stunning.
It's stunning.
That's incredible.
And that's what makes this tech so different is that, it doesn't, when you stand back, at first you think, oh, wow, we've got senior tax partners, senior lawyers, senior auditors, and it's actually because once they get across that barrier of interacting with this incredibly smart digital colleague, they have got the judgment, the knowledge, and the expertise to make that most useful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of not surprising. They know the problem the best. So that's where these boards, often once you get them through the immersive session of, they're touching and feeling and using the tech for business, they actually become the biggest zealots.
Yeah.
Because you don't, like every other bit of technology, there's been a kind of a barrier of, but how do I use it? If you gave any board member, or frankly any business person in New Zealand, if you said, hey, we've got an intern for you, that intern is based in another city, so for Auckland's based in Wellington, they've got 3 PhDs and 100 masters, but they don't know anything about your business, Paul. But you can use them whenever you want, but you can only email them or call them.
Yeah.
You would use that person exceptionally well. And if you only could think of using AI the way you'd use that PhD intern you've got, and that goes for how you give them instructions, but then when they give you something back, like let's say they were giving you some research about a future podcast, if they gave you something back that you felt like, oh, that was really helpful, but this bit here needs to change, if that was a person, you'd email them, hey, look, this is really great, but next time, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
You need to do that with the AI.
Yeah.
And as soon as you get yourself into that mode, we find that, funnily enough, humans that are exceptionally good at managing other humans, they become good at managing AI because it's largely the same.
Well, Been an amazing discussion. Really enjoyed it, Scott. We're out of time, so we'll have to finish it there. But I'm certainly looking forward to the next chat and having you back on the show. So, yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Cheers. And, of course, a big thank you to all our show partners, including PwC, Fortinet, Workday, 1NZ, 2 Degrees Spark, and Gorilla Technology. Of course, if you've been watching the video, make sure you're following us on our audio platforms and vice versa. That's it from us. We'll catch you on the next episode. See ya.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.